Hi, my name is Heather Huff, and I'm the Executive Director of Policy Analysis for California Education, or PACE.
My name is Mikal Kurlander. I'm professor and chair of the School of Education at UC Davis and one of the faculty co-directors of PACE.
Hello, I'm Trevor Cohen. I'm a research fellow at the California Education Lab.
Hi, my name is Iwunze Ugo. I'm a graduate student in economics at UC Davis and a graduate student researcher at the California Education Lab.
PACE's mission is to improve education policy and practice and to advance equity here in California. And so we work from early childhood into K-12 and into post-secondary access and success, with the goal of both analyzing where there are inequities in these pipelines and transitions and opportunities, but also to highlight solutions for paths forward.
For the last over half a century or so, we know more students are going to college than ever before, but we're increasingly worried about sort of what their college destinations and also their completion. And one of the things we know is that students who end up at more selective campuses are more likely to have better outcomes, including completion and even labor market outcomes. But we know that's partly a function of the inputs that they bring in when they apply to begin with, right? So access to be able to apply to those more selective campuses starts much earlier in life, including from sort of their family wealth and income. And so we have one of our main research agendas is to understand the inequality in the college pipeline.
Our work also, it goes beyond looking at just enrollment to look at the entire college pipeline from high school to college. That includes everything from academic preparation in high school to whether students apply to colleges, whether they're admitted, and ultimately whether they choose to or are able to enroll at the colleges that they are admitted to. And looking at that pipeline, we find that those disparities we see at the end of the pipeline, looking at the differences in rates of four-year enrollment. There are also disparities throughout the pipeline, pointing to the sort of broad reach of inequities, not just at whether students enroll, but how that process from going from high school to college can differ for students from different demographic backgrounds.
How is the use of standardized tests related to inequities in college admissions?
This project in particular, focused on testing, comes about from the long time attention we've placed on admissions standards, particularly at public institutions. And a part of that conversation has been the use of test scores. We know test scores are often a mirror of the broad inequalities that students face much earlier in their educational careers. And so if we're going to use something like test scores, we have to use it with a lot of caution, knowing that students have very uneven access to both teacher instruction, resources, an ability to retake tests, support for private support in testing. And so this project comes about from a look more closely at whether the SAT or ACT, the two dominant tests used for college admissions for public universities as well as private ones, is meeting some of the objectives in terms of reducing inequality in college access.
So because, as McCall said earlier, because test scores are such good measures of your personal background and the resources you've had access to throughout the course of your life, what they really do is they measure those things very well. And people who do better on tests in general are more resource people. And so those are the kids who, therefore, when you use test scores, get let into college. So, for example, if you are trying to predict who's going to do well in college, just using high school GPA, and then you add test scores to that, like I said earlier, your models will not improve at all. You will not improve your predictions of who will do well in college. But when you add those test scores, what you do is if you go from admitting socioeconomic disadvantaged kids at a rate of about 30% down to a rate of about 10% of the students in your incoming class. When you use test scores, you go from admitting Black and Hispanic students at a rate of about 24% to down to about a rate of 60% of your incoming class. So test scores are an incredibly efficient screen in terms of who you let into college, but they're not a very good predictor of who will actually do well in college.
How did research play a role in the University of California Regent's decision to halt the use of standardized tests in college admission decisions?
We had an event in November of 2019 that was very influential, I think, at engaging the public. It was with UC Berkeley. And that event raised up so many different facets of this college admissions question. I think the hook was, should we use the SAT or the ACT in admissions? But we invited researchers and practitioners across the state who weighed in on things like, are there inequities in the college recommendation letter process? Are there inequities in grades? Are there inequities in the quality of education that you receive in your high schools? And of course, we know that the answer to all of those things is yes. So let's make sure that we're not kind of identifying this one issue as a magic solution, when really the solution is much more complicated and much more important to keep our eyes on that goal of equity in college access, with this issue of inequity in assessment and standardized testing being something that we were addressing at that time. And other things, from there, things happened very quickly. There was a lawsuit where students sued UC for discrimination in admissions. There was a UC admissions task force that came out in support of keeping the SAT and the ACT. And then the pandemic hit, and we had to suspend assessments because students just simply couldn't take them. And that changed people's perspectives about standardized testing and education, but also about equity generally, as this issue of educational equity and who gets access and to what really became part of the national conversation and the conversation here in California in a much different way than it had been before. And then McCall and her colleagues wrote a commentary that raised up evidence that was in some sense a rebuttal of that task force report that made statewide news and national news as well, and really highlighted that there is a large body of research evidence that shows that there are inequities in the test in particular, even beyond these larger inequities in our educational systems. And then in May 2020, the UC Regents made the decision to eliminate the testing requirements and to revisit the longer term issue of testing.
What are the next questions and opportunities for college equity and access?
So we know, again, that the pandemic has been felt unevenly. And so on the one hand, we see applications increasing at the University of California by as much as 15% this year. So more and more students are applying to the UC. Definitely a lot of speculation that that's partly because they don't have to submit test scores. And so many students who maybe have high grades, high GPA, and were worried about their test scores before are maybe now feeling that confidence around applying to the University of California. And while it's too soon to tell how students will fare, we can tell you from our research that that the University of California is unlikely to be admitting many or any unqualified students. There were many, many more qualified students than we had spaces for. And what we know from Kramer's research and from our lab's research is that those students, that the GPA was the best predictor of their likely success in college. And so for the fear that the public might have that as a result of not using test scores, a lot of unqualified students are going to be admitted to the University of California, we don't have that fear. I also think this opportunity presents a really important point for all universities, not just the UCs, but across the country, to look at the diversity of their application pool, to what's happened to the income and race distributions, but also to the types of applicants that they've been able to admit this year, and to really learn about what inputs matter for the longer term kind of success of students once they get to college.
And so part of thinking about how do we improve equity in college admissions is also how do we improve opportunity in our entire K-12 system? the opportunity that we have right now is that public awareness of inequity in education through all the way starting in preschool through college is at a very high point right now. It's part of the public discourse in a way that it just hasn't been in the past. And that paired with this incredible, unprecedented infusion of federal money is a real opportunity to take stock of our systems and say, what do we need to do to redesign these systems to be equitable, to give all kids the kinds of opportunity that we want them to have, to eliminate the predictive power of race or income or zip code on your life outcomes. And so now is the time to really invest the money to meet those kids' needs through things like mental health supports and tutoring, and thinking about how our schools can serve relational needs and help students feel a sense of belonging and engagement. But all of those investments, the real way that those are transformational is by laying the groundwork for making big structural shifts in how we think about how we serve kids, particularly kids that have been least served by our institutions, and how we as a society make a bigger investment in public education.
What advice do you have for academic researchers and intermediary organizations seeking to inform policy in ways that promote equity and inclusion?
Yeah, so in trying to do policy work, compared to, let's say, more academic work, and especially if you're hoping to have the work be relevant or even better, more impactful, I think it's very important to sort of recognize your own skill set, as an academic, but then also recognize that, since this is policy work, right, it happens in an actual institutional context, right? So it's not enough to be, a very sharp academic. It's also important to really invest in that expertise, right? Knowing the policy area that you're hoping to work in order to not only leverage your own personal skills, but to apply them in a way that they can be most useful in sort of answering the right questions when it comes to whatever policy area someone's looking to work in.
Another thing is when you get to meet people who are doing things, maybe not academic research, but in your area of interest, is to ask questions. Don't lead with what you think you know. Go in and try to figure out, lead with curiosity, and try to figure out, what they can tell you.
When we think about how we impact policy decisions here at PACE, we think very comprehensively about what kinds of outreach and relationships people need. And we often in our activities think about what we do that has a very wide reach and what we do that's more targeted and direct engagement. And in really influencing a policy conversation, you have to be operating on all of those dimensions. It is important, especially now where it is hard to get people's attention, to engage with as broad of an audience as you can, with the media, in producing op-eds, in engaging with parents in a wide range of stakeholders. And it's also important on the other end of the spectrum to do this highly relational, one-on-one, collaborative work where you're working with decision makers to understand what are the challenges that you're facing? What's the information that you don't feel you have? How could our research support your informed leadership?
And so now over time, as I spend more time with policymakers and with stakeholders of different kinds, I ask questions differently because I sort of ask, how can the research inform better decision-making, better policies? I think when I started out, I just looked for interesting empirical puzzles or questions. And now I lean more into the questions that could be of service to the policy, to policy makers and to decision makers at multiple levels.